The first time I saw my lake cabin, after the HOA assigned it to someone else, Patricia Vale's son was sitting on my dock with his feet in my water, drinking from my cooler, while his mother stood on my porch, holding a clipboard like she had just won a war. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "This property now falls under temporary association control." That was a fancy way of saying she had given my cabin to her son for the weekend. What she did not know was that I had owned that cabin long before her little HOA office had a sign on the door. She also did not know that the fence line she kept pointing to was wrong by almost 80 feet. And when I corrected it, that new fence ran straight through the middle of their proud little HOA headquarters. Now, before I tell you how a lake cabin, one fake notice, one spoiled son, and a fence crew brought an entire HOA board meeting to a screaming stop, you need to understand something about Pine Hollow Lake. People think lake communities are peaceful. They are, until somebody with a badge from an HOA decides the water belongs to them. My name is Russell Carter. I'm 58 years old, and my family has been on Pine Hollow Lake since before most people around there knew it existed. My grandfather bought our cabin in 1968. Back then, it was not a vacation community. It was just woods, mud roads, fishing boats, and old men who believed a perfect morning meant coffee, fog on the water, and nobody talking before sunrise. The cabin was never fancy. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a screened porch, a tin roof that sounded like applause during summer rain. The dock leaned a little to the left, no matter how many times we fixed it. The kitchen cabinet stuck when the air got humid. The fireplace smoked if the wind came from the wrong direction. To me, it was perfect. My father taught me how to fish off that dock. My mother planted daylilies along the side path. My wife, Ellen, and I spent our first anniversary there because we could not afford a real trip. Our kids learned to swim in that lake. That cabin was not an investment. It was memory with walls. For years, Pine Hollow stayed quiet. A few families came every summer. Some retired couples lived there year-round. Nobody cared if your grass got too high or your boat cover faded in the sun. Then the developers came. They bought the wooded land on the north side of the lake and built a private community called Pine Hollow Reserve. Gated entrance, paved roads, clubhouse, tennis courts, walking trails, and houses big enough to make my old cabin look like a shed with windows. The brochures called it luxury lake living with rustic charm. That always made me laugh. Rustic charm usually means you still want the lake, but not the mosquitoes, mud, or people who were already there. At first, I had no problem with them. They stayed on their side. I stayed on mine. Some residents waved from kayaks. A few even asked about fishing spots. Most were normal people who just wanted a nice view and a quiet weekend. Then the HOA started expanding its imagination. The Pine Hollow Reserve Homeowners Association managed only the new development. It had no authority over the older independent cabins along the west shore, including mine. That fact was written in county records, plat maps, deeds, and the original lake access agreements. But facts are only useful to people who read them. Patricia Vale did not read them. She performed them. Patricia was the HOA president. She was in her early 50s, always dressed like she was late for a charity luncheon, and she had the kind of voice that made every sentence sound like a warning wrapped in manners. She drove a white Mercedes SUV and carried a leather binder everywhere, not a folder, not a clipboard, a binder, thick, black, zipped shut, and probably full of other people's misery. The first time I met her, she stepped onto my dock without asking. I was cleaning fish at the little table beside the water when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw her standing there in cream pants, wedge sandals, and sunglasses that cost more than my boat motor. "You must be Mr. Carter," she said. "That depends who's asking." Her smile did not move her eyes. "I'm Patricia Vale, president of the Pine Hollow Reserve HOA. I went back to cleaning the fish. "Good for you." That was probably not the best start, but I had been holding a knife and a catfish, and I do not like strangers walking onto my dock like they own the boards. She looked around at the cabin. "We're conducting a shoreline appearance review." I stopped. "A what?" "A shoreline appearance review. The lakefront is a shared visual asset, and all properties visible from association water access points affect community presentation. That sentence had so much nonsense packed into it, I almost respected the engineering. This cabin isn't in your HOA, I said. She smiled like she had expected that. Technically, no. Not technically. Actually. Her jaw tightened a little. Mr. Carter, Pine Hollow is changing. The older properties have a responsibility to support the broader lake standard. I support it by paying my taxes and minding my business. She looked at my dock, then the side yard, then the old boat shed. There are concerns about aging structures, unapproved shoreline storage, and visual inconsistency. I looked at the cooler, the fishing net, and the stack of firewood. You mean my stuff? I mean items that may create a negative impression. Then tell people not to look. That ended our first conversation. Not politely, not dramatically. Just with her standing on my dock, realizing I was not going to thank her for insulting a cabin my grandfather built with his hands. For about 3 weeks, I heard nothing. Then the letters started. The first one claimed my dock required association review. The second said my boat shed violated community color guidelines. The third said my gravel path created informal access confusion for residents using the walking trail near the HOA office. That one got my attention. The HOA office sat near the entrance road, about 200 yards back from the lake. It was a small building with cedar siding, a fake stone front, and a sign that said Pine Hollow Reserve Community Management Center. Fancy words for a room where people invented fines. Behind that office was a strip of wooded land that ran down toward my cabin. For decades, everyone assumed the HOA owned that strip because their office and storage shed sat along it. But my father had always said the old boundary markers were strange there. He used to tell me, "Russell, one day somebody is going to build something where they shouldn't." I never took it seriously. Most sons ignore at least half of what their fathers say until it becomes expensive. I took the letters home to Ellen. She read all 3 at the kitchen table, wearing her reading glasses low on her nose. Ellen is a retired school principal. That means she has dealt with angry parents, lying teenagers, budget meetings, and district officials who used 12 words when 2 would have worked. Patricia's letters did not impress her. She writes like someone trying to sound legal without paying a lawyer, Ellen said. She says we're affecting community presentation. Ellen looked over the top of her glasses. Russell, your cabin existed before her community had plumbing. I wrote back once. Just once. I explained that my property was not part of Pine Hollow Reserve, not subject to its covenants, and not under the authority of its HOA. I attached a copy of the deed, the county parcel map, and the lake access agreement. Patricia replied the same day. Mr. Carter, the association reserves the right to protect shared lakefront interests where adjacent properties impact community enjoyment. That was when I stopped replying. Some people do not want answers. They want resistance, because resistance lets them pretend there is a fight. I figured she would get bored and find some other person's mailbox color to hate. I was wrong. The trouble started the following Memorial Day weekend. Ellen and I had planned to spend 4 days at the cabin. Nothing fancy. Fish in the morning, grill in the evening, maybe fix the porch screen if I felt ambitious, which I probably would not. We drove up Friday afternoon with groceries, fishing gear, 2 folding chairs, and a lemon cake Ellen made because she said lake weekends required dessert. When we turned onto the old gravel road leading to our cabin, I saw the first sign. Private event, Pine Hollow Reserve, authorized guests only. It was stuck in the ground beside my driveway. My driveway. I stopped the truck and stared at it. Ellen leaned forward. Please tell me that is not on our road. It is on our road. She sighed. Not scared, not surprised, just disappointed in humanity. I got out, pulled the sign from the ground, and tossed it into the truck bed. Then we drove another 100 yards and found a golf cart blocking the driveway. Not parked beside it, blocking it. A young man in a sleeveless shirt sat behind the wheel scrolling on his phone. He looked up like I had interrupted his vacation. You can't come through here, he said. I stared at him. Move the cart. This is reserved. For who? HOA family weekend. I looked past him. There were people at my cabin. Not near it. At it. A woman was carrying towels onto my porch. 2 kids were running near the side yard. A cooler sat open by my steps. Smoke drifted from my grill. And on my dock, sitting in my chair, was a man in mirrored sunglasses with his feet up on my tackle box. That was the moment the air changed. You ever get so angry that you go calm? Not peaceful. Calm. Like your body knows that if it lets the anger out too quickly, something important will break. I walked past the golf cart. The young man said, "Sir, you can't." I said, "Move it before I do." He moved it. Ellen followed me up the path, phone already in her hand, recording. By the time I reached the porch, Patricia was stepping out of my cabin. My cabin. She had a wine glass in one hand and her leather binder in the other. "Mr. Carter," she said, like she was surprised to see me at my own front door. "What are you doing in my cabin?" She lifted her chin. "This property has been placed under temporary association access for the holiday weekend." For a second, I honestly thought I misheard her. "Say that again." She smiled. "Due to unresolved shoreline compliance issues and pending access clarification, the board authorized temporary use of the cabin as part of our family hospitality program." Ellen said, "You broke into our cabin?" Patricia's eyes flicked toward her. "No one broke in. The side door was unsecured." That was a lie. The side door had a lock that stuck unless you pulled it hard and lifted at the same time. Nobody opened it by accident. The man on the dock stood and walked toward us. He was in his late 20s, tan, expensive haircut, the same entitled face as his mother, but with less practice hiding it. "Mom, is there a problem?" "Mom, of course." Patricia turned to him. "Everything is fine, Brandon." I looked at him. "You're in my chair, on my dock, drinking from my cooler, outside my cabin." Brandon looked me up and down. This place was assigned to us for the weekend. Assigned. That word did something to me. Not rented, not borrowed, not mistaken. Assigned. Like my grandfather's cabin was a conference room with a sign-up sheet. I stepped closer to Patricia. "You have 10 minutes to get everyone out." Her voice hardened. "Mr. Carter, I would advise you not to escalate. The association has documented your continued refusal to cooperate, and we are prepared to involve law enforcement." Ellen laughed once. It was not a happy laugh. "Please do." Patricia looked annoyed. She was used to that line scaring people. I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff's office myself. While we waited, Brandon walked back toward the dock and started gathering his things slowly, like being told to leave private property was a scheduling inconvenience. The 2 kids disappeared inside the cabin. A woman I assumed was Brandon's wife came out carrying beach bags and looking embarrassed enough to make me think she had not been told the whole story. Patricia kept talking. She told me the cabin created legal uncertainty. She said the HOA had a duty to manage lakefront assets responsibly. She said my refusal to cooperate had left the board with limited options. I did not answer. Ellen kept recording. That bothered Patricia more than anything I could have said. When Deputy Harris arrived, Patricia walked toward him first. That is what people like her do. They try to own the first version of the story. "Deputy, thank you for coming. We have a hostile property owner interfering with an approved community event." Harris looked past her at me. "Russell?" I raised my hand. "Hey, Ben." Patricia's face shifted. Not panic yet. Just the first pinch of doubt. Deputy Harris and I had known each other since high school. He bought firewood from me every winter and had once helped me pull my John boat out of the mud after a storm dropped the lake too fast. He turned to Patricia. "Who owns the cabin?" She opened her binder. "The association has pending access authority connected to shoreline management." "That's not what I asked." Her smile tightened. "The matter is under review." Harris looked at me. "You got your deed?" Ellen held up our folder. "Printed and digital. That is why I married that woman." Harris read the deed. He looked at the parcel map. Then he looked at Patricia. "Ma'am, unless you've got a court order, these folks need to leave." Patricia stiffened. This is not a simple trespass matter. It is from where I'm standing. Brandon walked up then, holding a duffel bag. Are we seriously getting kicked out? Harris looked at him. You are not getting kicked out. You are leaving a place you don't own. There is a difference between justice and satisfaction. That sentence gave me both. Patricia tried one more time. Deputy, the board has authority to manage disputed amenities. Harris said, a cabin is not an amenity when somebody else owns it. The next 20 minutes were awkward, beautiful, and very quiet. Brandon's family packed their food, towels, coolers, and lake toys into 2 SUVs. One of the kids asked why they were leaving. His mother said, because Grandma made a mistake. Patricia heard it. I know she heard it, because her jaw moved like she was chewing glass. Before she left, she turned to me and said, you have no idea how complicated this is going to become for you. Ellen stepped closer. Patricia, you entered our cabin, gave it to your son, and called it association access. Complicated is already here. That night, we did not stay at the cabin. Ellen refused to sleep there until we changed the locks and checked everything. I did not blame her. We took photos of every room, mud on the floor, wet towels on the bathroom hook, food in the fridge that was not ours, a broken cabinet handle, my tackle box open on the dock. Someone had moved my father's old fishing hat from the wall peg and tossed it on a chair. That was the thing that got to me. Not the grill, not the cooler, the hat. My father wore that hat every summer for 20 years. It still had a faded sweat line across the brim. He had been gone 9 years, but that hat made the cabin feel like he had just stepped outside. Some stranger had tossed it aside like decoration. I picked it up, brushed it off, and stood there for a while. Ellen touched my shoulder. Now we document, she said. So we did. Photos, videos, written notes, Deputy Harris's incident number, names, times, the sign from the driveway, the golf cart, the people present, the statements Patricia made. By Monday morning, I had a locksmith at the cabin. By Tuesday, I had a lawyer. By Wednesday, Patricia had sent me a violation notice. That woman had trespassed into my cabin and still found a way to find me. The notice claimed I had disrupted a board-approved family hospitality program, interfered with community lake access, removed association signage, and created an unsafe confrontation in front of minors. Fine amount, $2,500. I laughed so hard Ellen came from the other room to check on me. Then she read it and laughed too. That was the last funny part for a while, because Patricia did not stop there. She sent a community-wide email saying an adjacent property owner had created a disturbance during a holiday event and that the board was reviewing legal options to protect family amenities from interference. Family amenities. My cabin. Then an attorney letter arrived. A real one this time. The letter claimed the HOA had a historical use interest in the cabin area based on long-term community maintenance, lakefront continuity, and implied access patterns. It demanded that I stop restricting access to the property until the dispute could be resolved. I called my lawyer, David Monroe. David was a quiet man with silver hair, half-moon glasses, and the energy of someone who would rather read land records than attend his own birthday party. He read the attorney letter twice. Then he asked, "Has anyone surveyed this recently?" "No," I said, "not since my father's time." He tapped the page. They keep using words like access patterns and shoreline continuity. That usually means they don't have a deed. What do they have? Confidence. A week later, David sent a survey crew to Pine Hollow. That was when the story stopped being about my cabin. The surveyor's name was Calvin Brooks. He was in his 60s, moved slow, spoke slower, and treated boundary markers like sacred objects. He spent 2 days walking the property, checking pins, comparing old plats, measuring from the road, the lake edge, and the old oak trees mentioned in the original survey. On the 3rd day, he called me. "You need to come out here." Those are never comforting words. When I arrived, Calvin was standing behind the HOA office with a roll of maps under his arm. Patricia's headquarters sat about halfway between the main road and the lake trail. Behind it was a storage shed, a paved patio, and a small boardwalk leading toward what they called the community overlook. Calvin opened the map on the hood of his truck. Then he pointed. Your western boundary is not where the HOA thinks it is. How far off? Depends where you stand. At the cabin, not much. Near their office, about 78 feet. I looked at the map. Then I looked at the HOA office. Then back at the map. Calvin. Yeah. Is their office on my land? He removed his cap and scratched his head. Part of it. How much is part? The back wall, patio, storage shed, and about 1/3 of the meeting room. I stared at him. He kept talking, because surveyors do not care whether your brain is ready. The old fence line everyone's been using is wrong. Looks like it followed a temporary livestock fence from the 1970s, not the deed line. Your father probably knew, or at least suspected. My father's voice came back to me. One day somebody is going to build something where they shouldn't. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the dead have a terrible way of being right. David came out the next morning. He reviewed Calvin's findings, checked the deed, compared the plat, and got very, very quiet. That was when I knew it was serious. Lawyers are like mechanics in one way. If they curse, the problem is obvious. If they go quiet, the problem is expensive. Finally, David said, Russell, they may have given your cabin to her son, but they built their headquarters across your boundary. What can I do? He looked at the HOA building. You can enforce your property line. That sentence sounded simple. It was not. David sent formal notice to the HOA. The letter stated that the association had trespassed onto my cabin, unlawfully used private property, and maintained structures across the true boundary line. It demanded all records supporting their claimed authority and gave them 10 business days to respond. Patricia responded in 6 hours, not with records, with rage. She called me directly. I answered because sometimes curiosity is stronger than wisdom. You are making a very serious mistake, she said. No hello? This survey is absurd. It was done by a licensed surveyor. We have operated from that site for years. Not my problem. The association will not be intimidated by some old cabin owner trying to exploit a technicality. There it was. Technicality. People love calling ownership a technicality when it is not theirs. Patricia, you gave my cabin to your son. She went quiet for 1 second, then said, that matter has been exaggerated. You were standing on my porch. The board acted based on available information. You broke into my cabin based on available information? You need to stop using inflammatory language. I looked at Ellen, who was sitting across from me at the table, listening. She mouthed, keep her talking. So I did. Do you have a deed? Patricia said nothing. Do you have an easement? Nothing. Do you have a court order? Mr. Carter, if you continue down this path, you may find yourself isolated in this community. That was meant to scare me. It did not. I had spent 58 years being perfectly comfortable alone with trees and a lake. Patricia, I said, the community you're talking about is partly standing on my land. She hung up. The next week, the HOA called an emergency board meeting. David told me not to attend alone, so Ellen came with me. So did Calvin, the surveyor. So did Frank, my neighbor from 2 cabins down, who had no reason to be there except that he loved trouble when it was legally documented. The meeting room was packed. That mattered because, according to Calvin's survey, the back third of that room was inside my property line. I sat in the second row and tried not to smile at the thought. Patricia opened the meeting by accusing me of attempting a hostile land grab. I raised my hand. David put his hand on my arm. Don't, he whispered. That man saved me from myself more than once. Patricia continued. She said the HOA would defend its amenities. She said long-term use created rights. She said the cabin incident had been misunderstood. She said the board was exploring all available remedies. Then Calvin stood. He did not ask permission. He just stood up with the kind of calm that comes from knowing math, does not care who is offended. My name is Calvin Brooks. I'm the licensed surveyor who completed the boundary review. The deed line is clear. The existing fence line is not the legal boundary. Portions of this building and the rear grounds are encroaching on Mr. Carter's parcel. The room erupted. Patricia struck the table with her palm. This is not an authorized presentation. Calvin looked at her. Boundaries do not require your authorization. Frank made a small choking sound behind me. Ellen looked down at her lap because she was trying not to laugh. A board member asked, "How much of the building?" Calvin answered, "Approximately 1/3 of the rear meeting space, the back patio, the storage shed, and portions of the walkway." Another board member whispered, "Oh my God." Patricia snapped, "We are not accepting this." David stood then. "You don't have to accept it. You do have to respond to it." He handed copies of the survey to each board member. Then he said, "My client is willing to discuss resolution. However, until that occurs, no HOA personnel, guests, family members, vendors, or residents are permitted to enter his cabin or use his lake parcel. Any future entry will be treated as trespass." Patricia stared at him. "What about the office?" David paused. That pause was beautiful. The office is part of the discussion. Over the next month, the HOA tried every trick. They claimed adverse possession. David explained that adverse possession does not work well when the true owner has paid taxes, maintained access, and the encroachment was based on a mistaken fence line tied to disputed records. They claimed community necessity. David asked where that was written. They claimed historical agreement. David asked for a copy. They claimed my father had verbally allowed use. I asked whether they had recorded my dead father's ghost saying that. David told me not to say that again. Then came the second mistake. Patricia sent workers to remove old trees and brush along the false fence line. On my land, Ellen saw them from the cabin porch and called me. I arrived 20 minutes later to find 2 contractors cutting saplings behind the HOA office. They had marked a straight path with orange flags. When I asked what they were doing, one worker said, "Clearing for security fencing." I almost admired the nerve. The HOA was trying to fence my land before I did. I called David. David called the sheriff. The workers stopped. Deputy Harris arrived again. He looked at the orange flags, then at the survey stakes Calvin had placed, then at Patricia, who had appeared from the office wearing the face of a woman who had swallowed a bee. "Ma'am," Harris said, "you were already told this boundary is disputed." Patricia said, "The association is securing its facilities by clearing his property." She pointed at the old fence. "That is the line we recognize." Harris looked at the fresh survey stake. "That is the line the licensed surveyor marked. This is civil." "Yes," Harris said, "and you keep trying to make it criminal." That sentence went into my memory and stayed there. 2 days later, David filed for a temporary injunction. The judge ordered the HOA not to enter, alter, clear, lease, assign, or use any portion of my parcel until the boundary dispute was resolved. The word assign was included because of the cabin. I framed that part in my mind. Patricia had given my cabin to her son. Now a judge had to tell her not to assign other people's property like party favors. But the real turn came from Melissa. Every HOA has one person who knows where the bodies are buried. At Pine Hollow Reserve, that person was Melissa Grant, the assistant treasurer. She called me late on a Thursday. Her voice was low. "I think you need to know why Patricia is fighting so hard." We met the next morning at a diner 30 minutes away. Melissa brought a canvas bag full of copies, board minutes, budget sheets, emails, contractor invoices, insurance documents. She told us the HOA office expansion had been Patricia's project. 3 years earlier, the board approved a small renovation. Patricia pushed it through fast. New patio, storage shed, boardwalk, expanded rear meeting room, landscaping, security lighting. The official cost was $184,000. That alone made David raise his eyebrows. Then Melissa showed us the contractor name, Vale Property Solutions, Patricia's brother-in-law. The land survey used for the expansion was a 1-page site sketch, not a legal survey. No boundary certification, no recorded easement, no title review, just a drawing with the old fence line treated as fact. And buried in one email, Patricia had written, "Do not delay this over old cabin parcel questions. The West Side owners never challenge anything." David read that sentence 3 times. Then he said, "That helps." Coming from David, that was the same as fireworks. The injunction hearing happened 2 weeks later. Patricia arrived with 2 attorneys, 3 board members, and the expression of someone who had spent the morning practicing calm in a mirror. I arrived with Ellen, David, Calvin, Melissa, and a binder thick enough to hurt somebody if dropped. The judge listened quietly. Calvin explained the boundary. David walked through the deed, survey, tax records, photos, cabin trespass incident, and HOA office encroachment. Then Patricia's attorney argued that removing or restricting HOA use of the office would cause hardship to the community. The judge asked one question. Did the HOA verify ownership before expanding the structure? The attorney talked for almost 2 minutes without answering. The judge asked again. Did the HOA verify ownership? Finally, the attorney said, "It appears the association relied on historical boundary assumptions." The judge wrote something down. Historical boundary assumptions. That is lawyer language for, they guessed. The injunction was granted and expanded. The HOA could continue using the front portion of the office temporarily, but could not use the rear meeting room, patio, storage shed, boardwalk, or any area beyond the surveyed line. They also had to remove any personal property from my parcel within 14 days. And if they wanted continued access, they had to negotiate with me. Patricia did not look at me when we left. That was probably wise, but I was not done. Because while the lawyers negotiated, I did something very simple. I hired a fence company. A good one. Licensed, insured, survey-aware. The kind of crew that measures twice, calls the surveyor once, and refuses to move a post just because someone in a blazer gets loud. The fence was black steel, 6 feet tall, clean and legal, with gates where I needed access, not ugly, not spiteful, not cheap either. Ellen asked if I was sure. I said, "She gave our cabin to her son." Ellen nodded. "Make it straight." The fence crew arrived at 7 o'clock on a Monday morning. By 8:15, Patricia was outside. By 8:20, she was yelling. By 8:30, half the office staff had come out to watch. The crew followed Calvin's survey stakes exactly. The fence ran from the lakeside woods, past the old trail, behind the patio, across the walkway, beside the storage shed, and then straight through the rear third of the HOA headquarters. Not literally through the building walls. We are not animals. It ran right along the legal line, which meant the rear exit opened into my fenced property. The patio was cut off. The storage shed was trapped on my side until they removed it. The boardwalk to the lake ended at my locked gate. And the sign for the Pine Hollow Reserve Community Management Center now sat 3 feet from a fence that made the building look like it had been put in timeout. Patricia stood there holding her phone, shaking. "You can't fence an HOA facility?" The fence foreman looked at the survey stake. "Ma'am, we're fencing Mr. Carter's property. This is harassment." "No, ma'am, this is Tuesday." I liked him immediately. At 9:05, Patricia called the sheriff. At 9:28, Deputy Harris arrived for the 3rd time. He stepped out, looked at the fence, looked at me, then looked at Patricia. I could tell he was tired before he even spoke. Patricia rushed toward him. "He is blocking association operations." Harris looked at the crew. "Are they on his side of the line?" The foreman handed him the survey copy. Harris reviewed it. Then he looked at Patricia. "Looks like they're on his property." She pointed at the rear door. "That is our emergency exit." Harris said, "Then you may want to talk to whoever built it, facing someone else's land." The office staff heard that. So did the board members who had arrived by then. So did 3 residents who were pretending to walk dogs. They clearly did not need to walk past the same spot 6 times. The fence was finished by 4:40 that afternoon. By sunset, the HOA headquarters looked different. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Corrected. That is the word Ellen used. Corrected. The next board meeting had to be moved to the clubhouse because the rear meeting room was off limits. Patricia tried to spin it as a temporary facilities adjustment. Nobody bought it. Residents had questions now. Why had the HOA expanded onto land it did not own? Why had Patricia's brother-in-law been paid for the project? Why had no legal survey been done? Why had my cabin been used by her son? Why had the board sent letters claiming authority it did not have? Why was the storage shed behind a fence? That last question came from a little old lady named Mrs. Wexler, and I liked her immediately. The board began turning on Patricia. Not because they suddenly loved me, because self-preservation finally woke up. The insurance carrier asked for records. The county asked for permits. The bank asked about collateral tied to HOA facilities. Homeowners demanded an audit. Melissa resigned as assistant treasurer and turned everything over to the new investigation committee. Patricia called it betrayal. Melissa called it sleeping at night. 3 months later, the settlement was signed. The HOA paid for the cabin damage, replacement locks, cleaning, legal fees related to the trespass, and part of the survey cost. They removed the storage shed and patio extension from my land. They paid for a recorded boundary agreement. They paid an annual license fee for limited emergency access behind the office until they could remodel the building and relocate the rear exit. The fence stayed. That was my favorite part. The fence stayed. Patricia resigned 2 weeks after the settlement. The official statement said she was stepping down to focus on family and personal commitments. That is how people say, "I lost," when they still want nice stationery. Brandon never apologized. I did receive a check that included reimbursement for the cooler, groceries, broken cabinet handle, cleaning, and the replacement of my father's fishing hat display peg. I did not cash it for a week. Not because I was noble. Because every time I looked at the memo line, cabin access incident, I started laughing again. The new HOA president is a retired accountant named Marilyn Brooks. She came to my cabin the following spring with a pie and an apology. Not a legal statement, not a board-approved phrase. A real apology. She said most residents had no idea what Patricia had done. I believed her. Most people in these communities are not villains. They are busy. They assume somebody else checked the paperwork. They assume the person with the binder knows what she is doing. That is how people like Patricia survive. They build power in the space between trust and exhaustion. As for my cabin, it is quiet again. Ellen replanted daylilies along the side path. I fixed the porch screen. The dock still leans a little left, because some traditions are stronger than carpentry. Every now and then, I sit out there in the morning with coffee and look across the water at Pine Hollow Reserve. The houses are still big. The lawns are still perfect. The ducks still act like criminals. And behind the HOA office, that black steel fence runs exactly where the deed says it should. Sometimes I think about Patricia standing on my porch, telling me my cabin had been placed under temporary association control. I think about Brandon on my dock, feet on my tackle box, acting like memory could be assigned by committee. Then I think about the fence. Straight, quiet, legal, and right up to their head office. People like Patricia believe ownership is a matter of confidence. Say something firmly enough, print it on letterhead, call it community policy, and maybe everyone will step aside. But land does not care about confidence. A deed does not care about a blazer. A survey stake does not care who is embarrassed. And a fence, when placed on the true line, can tell the truth louder than any argument. That was the lesson Pine Hollow learned that summer. You can bully a man over his dock, his cabin, his gravel path, and even his father's old fishing hat. But before you give his lake cabin to your son, make sure your own office is not standing on his land.